Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session, Storytelling for Parents. We would like to begin we're sorry that we're starting about 10 minutes late. There were some technical issues, but we hope to deliver a good session for all of you. So welcome. We begin the session with our traditional do's and don'ts. And I think they are very obvious now. We don't really need to emphasize. I'll quickly give you 1 minute to read through them. The two important thing is, one, please make sure that you interact in the webinar for the success of the webinar. There will be question answer sessions right in the end for any of those who want any personal questions to be answered. And please don't forget to give us a feedback. That is extremely essential for us. Moving on, the objectives of the webinar. While we still talk about stories, we talk about the power of stories and we talk about how stories work. One thing that we want to bring at the onset is that we are not going to discuss a lot about fiction stories, which includes fairy tales and folklores. The primary objective of this webinar is to make sure that we as parents interact with our children, we tell them stories so that we can create a bond. We can pass on our values and our belief systems to our children. So what we're going to probably help you do by the end of this webinar is that we will help you identify areas of your life, of your culture that you can share with your children. And what are the benefits of doing things like that? So let's quickly begin. I am your second trainer, the first one being Justin. I'll quickly introduce myself. I come from a finance background and I'm a mother of two wonderful children. Storytelling is part of my personal life at home as well as the professional life because I now work as a storyteller and a corporate trainer. Today's topic is very close to my heart because even before this was my profession, storytelling was what I did for my children every now and then. We would sit around dining tables and tell stories. We would have bedtime stories. Sometimes we would read through a book, but on others, either my husband or I would tell stories from our life. And we realized that our children benefit a lot from it. So I am bringing to you the knowledge of storytelling that I have acquired and the joy of storytelling that I have experienced with my children today in this webinar. Over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Shruti. One of the stories that my father used to tell his kids, now we were 5 children, 4 girls and me. The fact that he grew up in Malaysia. So he was a teenager during the Japanese occupation during the Second World War. And his family was in a place called Sitiawan, in a place called, near a place called Ipoh, which is a slightly biggish town if you're familiar with Malaysia. And so his family was in Sitiawan and he was in Kuala Lumpur trying to work. When the Japanese came in and occupied Malaysia for a good 4 years. Now the thing about him was that he was good with languages and he learned Japanese. He learned to read and write Japanese very quickly. And he became a translator for the Japanese soldiers. And it was useful for them to hire him for the purpose because they had a lot of local dealings with the locals, especially in terms of buying provisions, buying rice in particular, because their staple food was rice. And so he helped them with that. And he says that he even made a trip with them to Thailand to procure rice. And he did that. And at the end of 4 years, when the British liberated Malaysia from the Japanese occupiers, he had to find his way back to Sitiawan, where his family was. So he got onto a mini lorry, which was coming to Sitiawan, and they were coming back. But at this small town called Meglembu, everybody was asked to get off, and by the police there, and they were interrogated to find if there were any collaborators in that group, any collaborators with the Japanese. And so he was arrested. But the lorry driver was a friend of his father's, and he reached City of One, and he told my grandfather, "Your son has been arrested, and he's in Maglembu." So my grandfather and his eldest son got onto cycles, and they cycled for 69 kilometers the whole day, and reached this place called Maglembu. By which time, father got released. They came out, and there was tears of joy as they got together again because they were meeting after over 4 years. Um, the thing is that a father-son relationship is always strained. I don't know about you men, but my relationship with my father was always strained. He had expectations of me which I could not fulfill. So I think in a many ways, like I was a disappointment for him. He wanted me to get into engineering. I couldn't get into engineering. His ultimate happiness would have been if I got into IIT, but I couldn't. I got into advertising, which is what I wanted to do. And so there is always a strain, and I always like held it against him that he had expectations that I could not fulfill. But the thing is that when I hear stories like this, I am more compassionate. I am more empathetic to kind of realize that what they went through in their lives to give us the kind of lives that we had, which was far more comfortable than the lives that they went through. And the other day, he was on the phone with somebody or a long conversation, and he had his pen and he was scribbling something on the margins of the newspaper. Afterwards, I looked at the newspaper and I find that they were Japanese characters written in beautiful handwriting along the margins of the newspaper. He's 95 years old, but his memory is still pretty sharp. So that's kind of expectations that people have, parents have, and sometimes when you tell your stories is when there is a connection that happens, and good things
Justin,
can
sorry to
potentially
interrupt. People are
tell me.
facing a little bit of issues with the audio.
Tell
I
me,
think you're not very clear.
is it
People are writing on the chat. You might want to see that.
okay? Okay, can you hear me better now?
I think it's better, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's better now.
better. Were you able? Should I repeat myself, or is that okay? Please write in chat or unmute yourself and tell me.
If you can repeat it, that could be better.
Okay, fine. So very quickly, I'll say that my father, when he was a teenager, the Japanese occupation happened, and the Japanese were occupying Malaysia for a good 4 years. And because my father was good with languages, he learned the Japanese language and worked as translator for the Japanese, especially helped them to, especially helping them to procure rice because the Japanese were rice was their staple diet. So at the end of 4 years, the British soldiers liberated Malaysia, and my father attempted to come back. There was no transport available, so he got onto a mini lorry that was coming back to a place called Sitiawan, which his family was living at. And but the lorry got stopped, and they had to get off the lorry, and he was arrested because he was suspected as being a collaborator with the Japanese. And and so the lorry driver, who was a Tamilian like my father, reached Sitiawan and told his dad that he's got arrested and he's at Maglembu. So grandfather and the eldest son get onto cycles and cycle for 69 kilometers to Maglembu. By the time they reach Maglembu, father's got released, and they're really happy to meet after over 4 years. And the thing is that, like I was mentioning, a father-son relationship is very often quite strained because the father's expectations are quite high for the son, and he wanted me to become an engineer, ideally an IIT engineer, but I wanted to get into advertising, and so there was a bit of a conflict out there. and I always held it against him that, he never appreciated what I did and things. But when I hear stories like this about my father and what my mother tells me also, I appreciate that, what they went through in order to give us a good life. And I'm able to empathize and forgive him, right? Which is so important in maintaining a good relationship with your parents. I mean, even at this age, we like struggle to, are we still making our weekly phone calls to our parents to speak to them, because we are still their children and they want to hear from us. But we are so caught up with our lives and we are so busy with our own children and things, and we sometimes, you know uh, don't do that fundamental thing. But it just gives them so much joy to receive a call from their children. So that's just a bit of a story about this thing. Yeah. So quickly about the origins of storytelling. I've mentioned it in the past also, but storytelling has been a fundamental part of humankind. So as long as human beings have occupied the earth, stories have been told, and stories have been a fundamental, an essential part of survival and evolution. Where it was the way that people taught the next generation how to, where to find the wild animals that were edible, how to skin a deer and cut it open, and how to cook the meat over an open fire, what plants to avoid eating because they're poisonous. And mothers told stories about how the children have been naughty, and the children, of course, told stories about what they've been up to, and the stories continued generation to generation. And so tribes told stories in order to collaborate with other tribes, to come together for protection and for survival, to protect themselves from other rival tribes, and to grow together. It was from storytelling that you had agriculture coming out, where larger numbers of people could live together and thrive together. So you find that storytelling is a fundamental thing, like eating, drinking, procreating. And recent studies are showing that the way that we remember things, our memory, is based on the way that we pick up experiences and string them together in the form of stories and retain them in our minds as stories. So even something that happened like at childhood, you won't remember individual incidents. You will remember them as a series of events in the form of a story that's residing in the brain. I think that's absolutely fascinating. Even, of course, religions and myths, when you really look at it, started as stories. Somebody concocted stories. They told them orally. Through word of mouth, they were propagated well before the written word. And then at some point of time, they got written down on parchment paper, on barks of trees, on leaves, and they got preserved. And then at some point, they were read out because only some people were educated. And then books came into the picture. You're familiar with Gutenberg in Germany, who invented the printing press. He printed literature and scripture, and the common man was able to read the books for himself and decide for himself what to believe. And so you find that religions are fundamentally stories that started hundreds, thousands of years ago and have come down to us, to the extent and they affect us to the extent that our beliefs and our behavior is so dictated by what we believe, which are fundamentally stories, which I find fascinating. I mean, that's the power of stories, right? And much more recently, you have the whole Black Lives Matter incident that happened in the US, which, thanks to technology, through that one video on that policeman's chest camera, which picked up that incident, got transmitted within minutes across the world. and people were up in arms, not just in America, but across the world to UK and down to Australia and other countries in Europe. And you wonder, like, how is it that something witnessed on camera and captured on camera has moved people to an extent to say that we protest against this sort of behavior. We protest that a human being can be treated in this fashion. That is nothing but a story that is going around the world, and very, very quickly. So the point I'm trying to make here is that stories are powerful stuff, right? So they have a role to play throughout history. They have, and civilization has evolved through stories, and individuals have evolved through stories. And we decide which to believe and follow. And sometimes there's a thin line between truth and fake stories, right? Even fake stories are powerful. And so we've got to use our brains. I mean, you can have videos today created where you can have an Obama completely making a false speech, which he never made. I mean, that's scary. That's what technology is capable of doing. But that's the power of a story, right? And so, given how powerful stories are, shouldn't we be using the power of stories in the lives of our children and helping them in their evolution? Recent research is showing that a whole host of activity is happening in the brain when a story is told, which does not happen when you just make a statement of facts, saying that beta, eat your vegetables, it's good for you. You have a lot of iron. It has a lot of iron when you eat your greens. As opposed to if you were to tell a story about, imagine if you could become strong like Pele or like Messi and play football like him. And do you know what his secret is? It's not just that he's practicing his football every day, but his diet is important as well. And he's eating his greens. Yeah. Now, if you were to narrate a story like that, watch your children eating their karela and their greens. So different parts. Okay. So when a story is narrated, you have a storyteller and the story receiver, the listener. The brain of the two people are virtually synchronized. So, like when you're watching a movie or when you're reading a book, you are engrossed in the story. You become the hero. You are living out that story and you're feeling exactly what the hero is feeling, which is why you are moved to tears sometimes. And sometimes when the hero is going to get punched, you move because the brain is automatically reacting like the hero is reacting. Sometimes you just feel rage that somebody is being treated unfairly. So you realize that you are completely engrossed in the story and you are living out the story like as though you are part of that story, which is why many years later, if you try to recall the movie, you wonder, was it a book that I read, or was it a movie that I saw, or was it something that somebody narrated to me? Because as far as the brain is concerned, the brain has lived out the story in reality. The brain can't distinguish between uh, a story and real life, which is why if you watch a horror movie before you go to sleep, you're going to have nightmares, because as far as the brain is concerned, it has experienced it in reality. That's why I avoid watching any scary movies before I go to sleep. The other thing is emotions. You're moved emotionally, and simply because a whole host of neurochemical reactions are happening in the brain, a whole lot of these neurons are firing in the brain. I mean, a lot of research is being done, but we haven't even scratched the surface of understanding how stories affect us. What we know for sure is that it's powerful stuff. It's powerful stuff. Once your brain hears a story and is emotionally moved, it changes the structure of the brain. It is not the same anymore. So my sister is a teacher of school kids in first to fifth standards, and she was telling me that when a new class of kids join, within minutes she's able to figure out who are the kids who listen to stories and read books and come from families that tell stories, in like minutes. Firstly, she says their vocabulary is very different. They won't just say, I saw a big elephant. They will use synonyms like, I saw a humongous elephant or I saw a gigantic elephant. You can make out that their vocabulary is different. And then, so they use synonyms, and the confidence with which they express themselves is very different because they have a larger library of words to draw from, a larger library of emotions to draw from. And then, importantly, they are able to read between the lines. They're able to make inferences and make judgments and decisions based on the information that they've been given. And then, of course, if they've read science fiction and biographies and history, they are able to be involved in discussions with you, as opposed to it being just a one-way receiving of information. If the history teacher is telling something which she disagrees with, she's going to raise her hand and say, Miss, but don't you think that, because of the information and knowledge that she has already got. How are we doing, Shruti, in terms of time? Are we good?
I think we can move on. We
All
are
right.
running a little late. Yes.
Oh, I see. Okay, thanks. So why do we tell stories? So I remember one is, okay, we influence children's cultures, beliefs, and values in ways that we do not recognize in the stories that they witness in the household. Let me give you a quick example. When we were young, we were 5 children, I told you. My mother's youngest brother got married to a Tamil Brahmin girl. And so they had children, and the kids were two boys were a little younger than us. So they are being brought up as Hindu Brahmins, and we are Christians. So I've got first cousins who come from an entirely different religion and culture. So they dropped in home one day, and my cousin, who was good, like 10 years younger than me, looks at this cross which my sister was wearing. I mean, all of us have got these crosses. We've got this tiny cross here, which my mother had put on all the children. He looks at this cross and he asks his mother, Mama, why is she wearing a plus? It was fascinating for us because we take it for granted that everybody knows what a cross is and what it represents. But here was a first cousin of ours who didn't know that. And so the realization that people are so diverse in their cultures, in their religions. So, I mean, in civics class, we talk of India, and we're proud of unity in diversity. And I'm thinking, like, here's a family that is united in its diversity. So you get exposed to these little cultural differences within the family. And if you're able to talk about it, and I mean, so on one hand, you could turn around and say, oh, no, they're very different from us. We don't follow that religion or culture or anything. On the other hand, we could be inclusive and say, we are all Indians and he's your cousin, so accept him for the fact that he is family, and don't let the fact that he follows another religion affect the way that you see him. Now, the moment the kids learn that at a young age, the moment you go into an office situation, you're able to accept, oh, so-and-so is a colleague from Pakistan, especially in today's multicultural global situation. You sometimes wonder, oh gosh, I've got to connect with this branch office in Islamabad. Yeah, I wonder what they're like. And then what happens when you travel? The most fascinating thing happens, like Ravi would vouch for what I'm saying. When I travel, I bump into a Pakistani guy, sometimes bump into a Bangladeshi, and the guy is talking Urdu and I can understand him. And I talk back in Hindi and he can understand me. And I'm thinking, like, we're talking the same language. We're from the same subcontinent. I'm saying, what are we fighting about, for heaven's sake? So it's only when you cross these borders and get out and bump into those people that you realize that, gosh, we're all the same. So I'm saying that learning can happen at home. before they are exposed to the TV messages and the messages from our leaders who start pointing fingers and firing bombs at each other. I remember when, so we're talking culture, we're talking values. I remember when I was very small, I used to drive when I was sitting next to dad, and dad is driving the car in the rain. And I'm so shocked that I can't even barely look out of the window. And there are times when he slows down the car. And I remember asking, Dad, why do you slow down the car when there are people, walking on the side? He says, because if you splash, it'll, if you go fast, you'll splash the water onto those people who are walking there. And who are also the cyclists, you see? I say, oh, I see, okay. Guess how I drive the car today, 50 years later? I drive exactly like him. He never told me you should slow down. I observed him. I saw him driving that way. And then guess how my daughter drives the car? She drives exactly the way that I drive. You realize that these values and these beliefs and culture goes from generation to generation, and you don't even realize it. You know how you're influencing generations of behavior. Foul language. Where do children pick up language from? We of course say that, oh, they're picking up from the bigger boys in school. But what do we teach them at home? What are they exposed to at home? How do they see fathers treating the mothers at home? Is how they are going to treat their wives when they get married and they move out. So we are not only telling them stories, we are creating the stories that they're going to live out when they grow up. I remember following a minibus of children once when I was going to the gym, must have been about 6:30 in the morning. And this guy jumped the light. They're tiny, this was minivan packed with small children, jam-packed. I mean, you've seen that. He jumps the light. I'm standing behind him and I'm furious. I follow the guy up to where he's stopped to pick up the next lot of kids, get off the car. I stick my head into that driver's window and I yelled at him in my horrible Hindi. I said, you will not jump the red light when you're taking these kids. I think he got the message, but the kids, unfortunately, they got scared. They were wondering, like, what is this guy yelling at the driver for? But you know what happens? The kids are learning that that is the way you drive. And then you get onto a big bus, and the big bus driver is driving like he's driving a tractor. He's master of the road. He jumps the light, he goes off the road, he drives on the wrong side of the road. What are the kids learning? They're learning that that's the way we drive. But the way you correct it is teaching them the correct way to drive when they are in your car, and you talk about it and you tell them that is not done. The same thing. I mean, you can extend it to what is their views on money, what's their views on drugs and smoking. At some point of time, they are going to leave you, get married and move away, or they're going to go abroad to study. What are they going to depend on? You can pray saying, God, take care of my children. But God is limited, but God is working through you. You are the ones, they're going to depend on the stories that you told them, on the values that you taught them, to keep them safe when they are abroad, when they are by themselves, when there's nobody watching.
Perfect. That's wonderful. I think the point that Justin just now made is also about how often are these stories repeated at home. If we take the example of the language that children are speaking, there is so much exposure outside that they probably are thinking in their mind, all of my friends are speaking foul language. All of my friends are doing masti in class, which is probably considered as bad manners by parents. Why should I not do it? There is so much overload of sometimes these negative things happening around them. How do they stay grounded? How do they decide what is right or wrong? A lot of it will depend on how often these things are reiterated at home and how often they are practiced at home. And by saying that we need to do it often, I'm not saying that we make them sit in front of us and keep giving the gyan every now and then. No, they have to be done in a very subtle and a very diplomatic way. And what better way to do is through stories, and stories that you have lived, that you have, experienced all over. So moving on, we would like to say that, the children, whatever age they might be, they have a limited world. Some of them, if they're younger, say about 5, 6, or 7, they have their world restricted to their house, their school, and a few friends. Through your stories, you help them expand their world as well as shape their world. If you tell them about the states and the countries you have visited, you give them a visualization of what all you have gone through. If you tell them about the culture that you have lived, how your grandparents used to live in a rural world, or how when you went to a particular religious place, how they how did they take religion. So this religion could be different than yours. It could be your religion, and you could tell some values about your religion. But on the other side, it could be how you visited a mosque, or maybe next time you take them to a mosque or to a gurdwara. So you're making them experience the world outside their restricted frame through life experiences as well as the stories. What you're also doing in this is that you're giving them experience of various different emotions and various different aspects of life. There is happiness, there is poverty, there is anxiety, there is stress. You can also talk about the stress that is there in your office. If you tell them that, they get that picture that yes, life is not very easy for my dad and my mom as well. If you make them sit on a dinner table and say that you did not have a great day today and why was that, they will be able to empathize with you better. They will be able to understand. They will picture your office that yes, there's a desk, there's a chair. Mama is working there all day. There are a lot of colleagues. Papa can also have colleagues and friends. They get that picture. Unless you talk about your friends, unless you talk about your boss, they would not understand. So by talking to them, you're giving them a larger picture of what is happening in your life. Stories help them become nicer people. And why is that? Because with the stories that you're living at home and you're telling at home, gives them an idea of what is right and what is wrong. Sometimes they have a choice to make between the difficult right and easy wrong. A simple example that comes to my mind is that we all have house helps at home, and they're probably our age or maybe younger than us, and we end up calling them by their name. But they are much older than your children. Now, what do you tell them if they end up, there's an electrician that comes to my place and each time he rings the bell, there are people referring to him as Sunny aa gaya, Sunny aa gaya, Sunny aa gaya. But if I don't emphasize to my children saying that, no, he's not Sunny for you, he's Sunny Bhaiya for you, you will not be able to pass on that right values. You need to reiterate to them, telling them, these people have their own dignity. You need to respect them for their age and respect them for what they are. Just because they're working for you, just because maybe they are just a little lower in the society than you, it doesn't mean they don't have their own respect. By sharing such values and such experiences, you make them nicer people. There was once an instance that happened with me. I was driving in my, I was sitting on the back seat, and my driver, a new driver we just inducted, was driving my car, and I was sitting on the back seat with both my children. And we're just getting out of our society. Something, in our society is a very relatively small society, and we have narrow lanes. We have there's no rule, there's no written rules on the society walls, but we residents have kind of decided it's a one-way society. We go from one side, we come from the other. Having said that, there are no rules, so a new driver may not understand that. So this driver quickly takes out his cars and kind of starts to take out from the wrong side. Even before I could say anything to him that bhaiya yahan se nahi, yahan se le lo, this gentleman driving in his huge car comes and stops right in front of the car and starts to scream, howl. And gets down of this car right in front of the window, says that, starts screaming on this driver. And I, very humbly roll down my window and say that, sir, I'm sorry for all the inconvenience. This guy didn't know, we'll quickly move out. He just would not listen to me. He would continue to scream on the driver. And when I tried to interview any further, he's telling me, Madam, aap to rehne do. Aap in logo ko encourage kar rahe ho, and look what you're teaching to your children. That is what was a break point for me. I got down of the car with all my dignity, but I actually screamed on this gentleman. And why did I really need to do that? Because I wanted my children to observe that not a gentleman on the road can start screaming on their mother, and the mother would just, sit quietly and listen to it. I had to teach my daughter that nobody can take her for granted, and scream and suppress her in spite of the fact that there was nothing wrong. I was also teaching my son that's not what gentlemen are supposed to do. Gentlemen are not supposed to treat the staff, a driver, or a woman like this. Such are the stories that you live, and such are the stories that you tell your children. If you don't practice such things, and if you don't tell the stories, coming back to my previous point, it is all about what you emphasize and how often you emphasize. If you emphasize on something once or twice, it stays in the back of the mind. It doesn't come on forefront. People don't live those values. For them to live those values, they have to be practiced every day in and day out. The other thing is about real life stories. Sometimes stories are considered as fight simulators. Why is that? Whenever a pilot is taught to fly, he's given an environment which is similar to a flight. And he tries to practice at home. I think the stories are very similar to that, not at home, sorry, at his workstation. So I think stories are very similar to that. This can be approached in two different ways. One, out of my life, out of your life, you tell your children stories of the struggles that you've gone through, of all the difficult areas, stories about hard work, story about teamwork, stories about empathy, stories about taking care of your responsibility, respecting of elders, stories about showing courage when times are difficult. You sit around at home during your free time when you kind of tell the children, turn off the TV, turn off the devices, and we want to sit and talk. You tell the stories about your life to make sure and understand that these stories will come handy to them in the future when they face a situation like this for the first time. It will not be like they are completely naive. They will remember the stories that you told them. Remember the story that how probably my dad was bullied in school, and he's heard that story from his dad, and how his dad stuck up to that. And it's going to make a difference to him that if I'm being bullied, I don't have to run away from the situation. I want to stand up to that situation. And it is not going to be the first time for him. He will have the memory of how his dad told that situation. Or for girls, how the mom probably told her a story about how she was not treated well, probably in a family or something. And the girl who probably gets married will know that, no, my mom also stood up for herself. I will also do that. So when the difficult situations come, it will not be the first time for them. They will have the experience through your stories and through your eyes. The other approach to this is that as parents, you judge their situation. When a child comes back from school, a younger child comes back to school and he kind of seems visibly upset, rather than saying, dear, what is the problem? How was your day? Just judge that there is an issue and start talking about it. That, there were times when I also had a difficult day at school. And try and understand, what do you think is going wrong? When you start to talk about your days in school and the difficulties that you were facing, there are very high chances that that child will also say that, yes, there are difficulties in schools every now and then. On taking care of little elder children, they might face difficulties as well. There could be problems where they're having relationship problems. There could be times where there will be problems like ragging, problems like all the other children wanting to spend a lot of money and they don't think that they have the sufficient money to do that. There's a lot of peer pressure these days. If you are able to identify or anticipate any of these problems, you may be right, you may not be right, but at least if you begin talking by saying a story, the story is always followed by a story by the listener. Try this one time and you will see that when you tell a story, invariably your child will open up and say that, yes, mama, something like this has been happening to me as well. Which is where you get them talking, and which is where gives you an insight of what is happening in their lives. You can keep going on and asking them, beta, what is wrong? Tell me what is happening. Tell me you need any help, but it's not going to work. Only when you build a scenario that, yes, this conversation, we are sitting here to exchange our stories. This is my side of story. Why don't you share your side of story? That's when you see your children opening up, and that's when you see a connection happening. I would like to open the floor for a conversation right here. Is there anyone who wants to share such experiences, that where you have had experiences where either your parents have told you a story, or you have told a story to your children to maybe bring out some values and bring out values of religion and for culture and belief system, or values like you want them to live, say a teamwork, a respect for elders, anything, any stories that you want to share?
Yeah, hi, good morning. Can
Yeah,
I
hi, Ravi.
tell a small story? Yeah,
Yes,
Shruti?
please.
Yeah, this is Ravi Gandham. I'm basically an engineer right now and working with an international marketing company. The story, till now, I was under the impression that as a parent, what stories I told, I have one beautiful daughter and one pretty wife. That's my family background. So I was under the impression that I have to tell a story which I keep telling my daughter, my experiences, etc. But after listening to Justin and you, I felt that I should tell a story which my father, my parents did that in a very subtle manner. Uh, I just struck my mind, I wanted to share that. I come from a very small town called Vizag in Andhra Pradesh. I belong to that place. And there were not many schools, hi-fi schools those days. I'm talking about 35, 40 years back during my childhood. But we had one convent school run by some Christian missionaries, and there are a lot of Telugu medium schools. So my father was working with a company called Hindustan Shipyard. He was in a very low post as a welder, physically doing the welding job for the shipbuilding. Uh, but when he was working, he was struggling to bring up the family, a large family we had. So it was a tough call because his salary was less and to bring up the family. So he was very keen that I become an engineer and a manager. So, but he didn't have the vocabulary skills or the art of communicating those days to tell me that I should study. The only thing he used to tell is, you study well, then you'll get a good job. Study well, get a good job. So it was like something, a repeated sentence we used to tell, which I said, oh, I think all parents say the same sentence.
Baby, no.
Yeah. Sorry, somebody
What do you
saying
want?
something? There's an interruption.
Sorry, I fixed that. Please go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead, yes.
Okay. So my father could not express, why I should study. So what he used to do is, at times there used to be a ship launching or something, some event. A new ship was built and it is launched. He used to take me to the shipyard, and he used to show me the difference of how the workers were there and how the engineers and the managers were there. He used to tell this, like, when you study, you become an engineer, you see their office is different. He used to show me their office, which is something like an air-conditioned cabin and with the telephone and all that, table, desk. Whereas the workers used to sit in a huge hall. That is a place where they used to rest. And he also used to show the canteen, which is different. The canteen, the workers' canteen was quite huge. There were hundreds and hundreds of people eating at the same time, and it was chaotic. Whereas the officers' mess was slightly elevated, the toilets were carbonated, and those things, differences were there. So he used to tell in a very subtle manner. I mean, he was not able to communicate, but his communication was, he used to show the difference. This is how, when you study, you will become like this. When you don't study, you have to struggle with me like this, working with the hands. And his hands were literally, uh, they were very tough because you have to do the welding and all. And to add to that, my mother also, she also struggled, and she put me in one of the only convent school there. She struggled, paid fees, and she said, "You have to do engineering or something. You need to have an English education. The Telugu will not help you. You will not succeed in life." So she struggled, and she put me, and my father gave me this kind of education. I think both the parents, they built a nice example, a nice story to me, and explained it in a manner in which it entered my brain. Fortunately, I listened to them, studied, and today I'm here.
Perfect.
So I'm happy that to bring out this story. It's a true one, and I owe all this to my parents who struggled really to bring us to a decent position today.
Absolutely.
So I have to pay my thanksgiving or regard through this forum to my parents.
Perfect.
Thank you for
Perfect.
sharing.
And thank you for sharing, giving me this time to talk.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I think it's absolutely wonderful. It's a wonderful example of the fact that it's not always about telling the story, it's about showing the picture.
Yeah.
So they had that clear objective in their mind. Instead of doing the instructions every day and making sure that the child understands, they show the path and give them the picture of the future. So yes, that's perfect. Anyone else?
May I share?
Yes, Joshi, so please go ahead.
Yeah. I'm just referring to the point which you have earlier discussed, your family culture and values that brings in the generations together. I would just refer to my father, who was a jailer, the central prison. He was a jailer. Though the salaries were very less, they were all the time in a commanding situation. The orderly, the pews, the office structure and all. But I've seen my father, he was so kind and generous. He was respecting all those peons or orderly, that was a great learning for me. And the top of it, I've seen that there were certain prisoners who were highly intellectual, but because of some mistake they have committed, they were in the prison. But I always remember that my father used to respect those prisoners in their respective field, and they were given that proper identification and recognition. He was given that important, though he's a prisoner. Actually, prisoner in those days, it's very difficult to recognize them, but he had a very great mind. He has committed some mistake, but it doesn't mean that he's a bad man. So let us look at the best points or the plus points of the person and motivate them, try to bring them at the right direction in the life. Maybe he's there, that prisoner is there for 2 years or 3 years. After that, he'll be leaving the prison and living his life. But when he will have the experiences that somebody has treated me nice when I was a prisoner also, that person is going to be great asset to the entire community. And that is what I've learned from my father, my parent, their culture and their values. And at times I feel that, at times when we are grounded and we are humble, it's all a gift from our parents to us. So
Absolutely.
This is what is, thank you for giving me an opportunity.
Absolutely.
What a beautiful story, Mr. Joshi. Thank you so much.
Anyone else would like to go? Nishant, would you like to help us with the story?
Hi, Shruti. Hi, Justin.
Hi.
So I think it has been a great session till now, and in fact, quite insightful. Good to hear some good stories also. So and in fact, what Ravi mentioned across, again, my thoughts instantly went back to my own past. So the story goes back to 2000, and similarly, like I also came from a very, very humble background, and my father was a principal. So in those days, like engineering was a craze. IIT was something which he wanted me to go for, and most of the people from my school went for IIT at that point of time. So I decided to go for hotel management, which was from IHM, and then I finished my hotel management and I got my first job. And there was a time when I got my first appointment letter, which was at a salary of 2.5K at that point of time. And the story, or like, okay, the incident which comes to my mind is that when I showed that appointment letter, of course, like, okay, there was a lot of feeling which was going inside, because he was a firm believer that I must go for engineering. And I took a different path. So obviously, like, okay, most of the time, the way parents would react is that, beta aapko bataya tha ki ye kar lo, lekin you choose your own path, and this is where you land up. However, like, okay, that once incident of, like, okay, finally showing that appointment letter, and I think the earlier generation had this very, very good habit of, like, okay, preserving memories. So somewhere, like, okay, he had the pay slip from 1970 to 2000. And then he opened up that Almira, opened up that big file, which had the pay slips from 1970 first salary. And it was a half an hour conversation where, like, okay, finally he showed across probably, like, okay, some milestones. So first salary of 330 rupees in those times. And then finally, like, what was utilized, where was it utilized, how did he, like, okay, finally build up onto it. So that was one thing, like, okay, and it gave a completely encouragement that wherever you start from, you made a decision. Now it's basically to make it right. There's nothing, like, okay, which should stop you right now, because whatever you decided across, that was a choice which you made. And now it is up to you, like, okay, that how do you travel this journey. So that's one thing, like, we have finally put across a lot of, like, motivation at that point of time. And even if I reflect and what you guys just narrated across, now nowadays date when I narrate again, like,
Nishant, your voice is breaking. You might want to turn off your video.
so
You have low bandwidth. We can't hear you, your last bit.
can I be heard now?
Yeah.
Yes, it's much better. Please go ahead.
Okay. So coming back to current times, and my kid who is 10 years old right now, and just a couple of years back or 18 months back, I took this course of Byju's for him. Now, obviously, like, okay, when you have that kind of a background where, like, okay, initially, whenever you used to get things, you used to have a lot of high respect, because in those times, like, those things used to come at a much higher level of effort. And at times I see that, like, okay, that tab not being respected, or it is being thrown across. So somewhere, like, okay, I again picked up some of the letters which my father wrote to me when I was in college. And those letters, like, okay, finally had some kind of a narration in terms of values. And reading those letters, like, okay, this point got communicated to him in a much better manner, that how do you cherish things which are given to you rather than taking it for granted. So I don't like, and I think, like, what Ravi mentioned across, I resonated completely, that somewhere, like, okay, going back to our times and then relating it to our kids has a much higher relevance as compared to just putting in a narration or something as a learning or morale for our kids. Thanks. So I thought, like, okay, it would be relevant to share this experience.
Perfect. No, absolutely. Nishant, apart from telling your story, and I'm sure your parents are really proud of you, what you have also done is you've reiterated the point that we were making, that if you hear the story from somebody, your brain starts to work and you reciprocate with the story. If we practice, like Ravi told his story, and you are reciprocating with your story, if we practice it at home, when we tell our story to the children, they start reciprocating with their stories, which is a wonderful tool to get the children to open up and talk about their issues. Because sometimes these days, parents like us struggle the most is that we don't have a bond, we don't have a communication channel with our children. If we try through stories, this is the point that we were trying to make, that it's going to work wonderfully.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Nishant. Anyone else? Rekha, do you want to go? Paramita, anyone? Or should we move ahead?
Let's have one story from the ladies. One of the ladies. One of the mothers.
Good morning, Justin. Paramita.
Good morning, Paramita.
Good morning, Shruti.
Good morning.
I would just probably, it's not really a story. It is more to do about how, you conduct yourself, and that itself kind of becomes a story. I've been working I was working.
We're losing you in between, Paramita. We can't hear you. Sorry, we can't hear you. Okay, maybe she can come back in the time somebody else wants to go. Yeah.
If you permit me, both Justin and Shruti, I just wanted to make just one comment on what
please.
Mr. Joshi said about his story. He said his father was a chief jailer, and he used to treat the prisoners with respect,
Right,
and,
dignity.
depending on their profession and all that. I think a very important point.
Ravi, you're broken up. Yeah, can't hear you, Ravi.
Sorry. This is related to Mr. Joshi's story about his father, who was a jailer. So I was very happy to note that the father used to respect the prisoners, their profession and all that. Instead, if you let them live like that, they would become much more hardened criminals. They would turn something bad instead of going into the positive way. But on the contrary, when you respect them, they would be much more happy, and they would turn to be a better citizens than becoming a much more criminal. I think that is a point probably you observed while you were associating with your father and watching all the things happening in the prison activities. So what your father done is a very splendid job. I can say that, because he worked for the society to improve, not to go worse.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, sharing that story.
Absolutely. If Paramita, do you want to try again?
I don't know whether I'm audible. You'll have to tell
You
me.
can give it a shot. Yes, you're audible right now.
Okay, so I'll quickly sum it up. It's basically that since I was leading a large team of about 42 people, so often it would go beyond the professional call of duty, and people would keep connecting to me even after school hours with their personal issues and any kind of challenges that they're facing. So very often I would end up spending my evenings in trying to resolve things which were not really professional in nature, but then I knew that if I had to keep the team together, I had to do it that way. So it would obviously eating up a little of my family time. So my children would often say that, Mama, why is it that you're doing this? I mean, your office time is over and this is the time for us and for family, and you're still devoting so much time in resolving their issues. So every time they told me this, I told them that whatever you can do, have the habit of giving. There is no harm in giving whatever you have, because finally, someday or the other, it will come back to you. So this is what I would often tell them. Probably at that point of time, it did not really make a lot of sense to them. But in August 2018, I was faced with a very serious medical crisis. So I was in the ICU. I actually had a brain hemorrhage. So it was like a life and death kind of a situation. And when I was in the hospital, when I came back home after 3 weeks, by God's grace, my children came back and they hugged me and they told me that, Mama, everything that you did for your team, they were so very thankful. They all came back to us. They stood by us like a rock by the time you were at the hospital. So I think the learning came for them in action. So there was not much left for me to say or to do. But I think I had conveyed to them that it was important to go beyond your own self and do for the others what you can in your own purview. So
Absolutely.
I got kind of emotional. Sorry.
Absolutely. That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm sure you is imparting your learnings to us as well. So thanks everyone for participating. I will quickly move on and make the mood of the training a little lighter by saying that not all the time you have to share the intense stories. We have to share the intense intense stories, but let that not be all the time. What we can also do is that share some light-hearted moments with our children. What we sometimes want to do is we want to talk about our childhood in a fun way. We want to share with them what are the naughtiness that we all did when we were young. Maybe, sibling fights, and maybe when you rang the doorbell of a neighbor and ran away, and things, endless things that you and I have done when we were growing up. What that does is that breaks the shell that children sometimes have in their head, that our parents are disciplined, they are rock solid. But when you tell them that you had a standard childhood, and the way you used to play, the way you used to dance in the rain, the way you used to probably do something naughty and you were hammered by your parents or the teacher, each one of us have gone through these things. And when you tell these things to your children, they find it very hilarious, one, yes. And the other thing is that they open up to say that, yes, mom, even I did something naughty today, and you kind of give high fives and said that yes, it was absolutely fine. So what that does is that increases the bond between the parent and the child in a more light-hearted way. Moving on, I will quickly share a video, and I hope you can appreciate that. Let's see.
But then one day, as I was heading out of the house for my...
Can you hear it?
Yes.
Okay.
Time.
Yeah.
But then one day, as I was heading out of the house for my evening walk, I overheard my father talking to someone on the phone in his room. This conversation sounded familiar. The door was slightly ajar, so I could see him. He was talking to one of his closest friends, trying to resolve a misunderstanding. As each moment passed and his temper grew higher, he seemed more and more helpless. And that's when I realized that my father, a 50-year-old man, was going through something that I was a few days ago. He looked worried. He seemed stressed. And it's not that I never saw him stressed before. What with his work, putting up with us, crazy family version 1,000,000.0, he'd lose his mind every once in a while. And I would never understand that. But this was different. And I felt a sharp ache in my chest. That misunderstanding between my father and his friend suddenly made me realize that maybe there's more to my father's life than I ever tried looking at. For me, he was Iron Man, quite literally. But now I could see in him a soft-hearted person, worried about losing someone he cares so much about. And my heart warmed up to him like never before. I always loved him no matter what, but now I could empathize with him. And to find a little bit of you in someone else, that meant the world to me. As he got off the phone, I was still standing there. He looked up at me with a question mark on his face. I walked up to him. I still had no words. I didn't know what would make a 50-year-old man feel better. But I did what I would do for anybody who was upset. I placed my palm on his head and ruffled his hair. I hugged him tight and stayed there, with my arms wrapped around him and my face on his chest. A tear rolled down my cheek, but being the Iron Man's daughter, I pulled out of the embrace and turned away so that he wouldn't see me cry. Sometimes the people we love But then one day, as I was heading out of the on his chest, a tear rolled down my cheek. But being the Iron Man's daughter, I pulled out of the embrace and turned away so that he wouldn't see me cry. Sometimes the people we love become invisible to us, much like our habits, and we lose the chance to communicate, to understand them, and to show them that we love them too. Who knew that all it would take to fix the recipe for complicated was a teaspoon of empathy and understanding? As I was walking away, my father called me from behind. Chalo beta, aaj walk par chalte hai. I smiled and said, "Haan, Papa." And just like that, we went for a walk, like we always did. Still silent, but now I held his hand, like I used to when I was about 6 years old? And I knew then that my father, the Iron Man, whose temper is at a constant high, does have a heart. A heart of steel, but a heart nonetheless.
Hi. So, did you guys like the video? Does anybody wants to share any comments on the video?
See, I would like to share one thing. Her father was speaking on the telephone, and we always say that children are always imitating. They are observing. Their observation power is too good, and some of the challenges between the family, within the family, can be solved uh, when they are observing us unknowingly. And then she has understood her father, that he has got a heart to, though he's a Iron Man. So for any of our actions, we will have to be very choosy, that our children are always observing us, they are imitating us. For at times when our children grows and they behave something different way, it is our reflection, our mirroring only. It is not their fault. I mean, that is what I would like to say on this.
True, true. Anyone else? We're looking for one specific point here.
Shruti, what came across to me very strongly in this particular video is that it is okay to let your children know that you're vulnerable. Always we are putting up a very strong front and, doing the right things and making the right impact. But I think if you show that you're vulnerable, they empathize with you a lot more. And I think the bond can get really strengthened if you show that you are just as vulnerable as they are.
Perfect. Perfect. That's exactly the point we were trying to make here. The additional thing here is that it is not always important that you share with your children your wins, your successes. It is absolutely okay to talk to them about those things that did not go well, those things that you probably, did not succeed in. But you also end by saying that, this is what I learned in the process. This is how things could have been different if I would have not made that mistake. So it's absolutely okay to, share with them the struggles that you have gone through. And probably, we would also like to say here that you don't have to probably tell them that they need to make all the mistakes themselves and try it out. You could give them simple examples of mistake that you made, and they are going to learn from your experiences. As basic examples like, you were riding a bike without a helmet and you kind of, had an accident. So tell them, this is why you really need to wear your protective gears or stay safe. You were probably climbing a tree and you got hurt and you have a scar somewhere, and you tell them, if you're not safe while playing, please make this could happen. They're going to always remember that, remember that story whenever they see that scar on your leg. So if by telling such stories, you will not have to give the instructions over and over again. The stories will stick and will probably, we hope, keep them safe by listening to the stories that, listening to the mistakes that we as parents have made some time ago. So this is what stories do. Moving on. Justin, would you like to go?
Yeah. So speaking about struggles and allowing the children to see our our vulnerabilities, our vulnerable side. This is a classic story arc, and more often than not, life is carrying on normally, and suddenly an obstacle comes in the way, and the hero overcomes the obstacle, very often with the help of a wise person, and returns to a normal, this resolution, but in a new place, but there has been new meaning that has been acquired. So actually, Aristotle discovered this classic story arc in 400 BC, roughly 376 BC or so. And you realize that as stories go, they have a clear and solid shape and foundation, which is what makes them powerful. So if you think about it, if you have a story, you went in to watch a movie, and you have a story where boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, boy gets married to girl, and they live happily ever after. You don't have this story shape, this arc. You have a straight line. And a straight line, even in your medical situation, is a dead line. So there is no story there. The story invariably has to have an arc, which is why, and the thing is that stories reflect life, and life reflects stories. And, invariably, we have desires with a particular outcome, but it's not easily achievable. Whether it's a competitive exam and I want to get into an IIT or an engineering college or a medical college, and I have to study, and I have to compete with thousands of students across the country, and I don't get it the first time, but I attempt the next year and study, and I get through it. You have classically gone through that arc, and the story has taken the shape of the arc. Or you want to go abroad to study, but the funds are inadequate. Where do you get the funds from? Would I get a sponsorship? Would I get a loan? So invariably, you have a desire and you have an objective, and in between is an obstacle. Invariably, there's an obstacle. I've known enough friends from my school days in Chennai who wanted to go to Bombay to become actors. They felt they were actors, as they were good-looking guys, but they finally discover that just talent and good looks is not enough to get a break in Bollywood. A lot of them just came back disappointed, got into regular jobs. For me, when I joined advertising, my greatest desire was to work in this company called Ogilvy and Mehta, which was the most respected agency in the country and in the world, actually. But I had to try, and finally I got in, and I end up spending over 1/3 of my career in the agency. So classic. It's like in college, I get into advertising. I want to join, but it's a struggle. I have to work in several other agencies where I'm not satisfied at all. Finally, I get that break and join this dream agency of mine, and then I end up spending 12 delicious years. And I reach a point where I have new meaning, new learnings have happened, and I'm doing this training today simply because of the insights that I've had there, of the learnings that I've had, of the people that I've interacted with, the places that I've been to, and the experiences that one has had, and that have shaped the kind of person one has become, and the stories that one tells today. So life is like that. You can't get away from it. The beauty of life is that what makes life worth living does not come from the rosy side of life. We would like our children to have like peaceful, uneventful lives, protected, but it doesn't happen that way, does it? Our lives never happened like that. Our parents' lives weren't like that. We have learned that the energy to live comes from the dark side. We've learned from the things that we've encountered and overcome. So let's not just tell the stories that are not just tell the happy stories, but the struggles as well, depending on their age. And because acknowledging the dark side, like Paramita just shared with us, the struggling side of life makes you more authentic and more convincing as a mother and a father.
Sorry.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. So because we're a little short of time, we'll move a little fast on this slide. These are basically practical tips that will help you start telling stories as soon as you finish this webinar. Maybe on lunch table today when you sit with your children, we want you to tell stories, and obviously depending on their age, you will decide your own stories. We can only give you some guidance on this. These are some of these most popular areas on which you should tell stories every now and then to meet all the objectives that we have discussed up until now. Let's talk about stories when the children were young. For us as parents, one of the most important day of our life was when our children was born, and probably it is one of the most important day in their lives as well. But have we told them the story of that particular day, the day they were born? Where were you? Were you probably watching a movie, or were you at home when you suddenly had to rush to the hospital? What did the doctor say? How much pain did a mother go through when the child was born? Was it a normal? Was it a cesarean? Has the mother probably shown the child the scar that she has up until now because the baby was born? Or a lot of other things. How did the family react when the baby was born? So by telling these stories to the children, probably you're passing on the stories about the most important day of their life. I remember my mom telling me that the day I was born, there was a medical strike in the hospital and there was no doctor available to take care of her, and they really had to run around. And my father telling me that, he took her 9 months old pregnant wife on a two-wheeler all the way 10-20 kilometers away from home to the hospital. Those were the days when you didn't even have a car and you had to take people on a two-wheeler to an hospital. So those stories we've heard so many times, it ends up making me feel that I'm reliving and visualizing the day I was born. So if you tell these stories to the children, they absolutely love them. Tell the stories about their first day at school, because obviously they don't have a lot of memories of those days. Tell them about some of the religious festivals or religious ceremonies that happened when they were young. Say, for example, in Hindus like us, we have a big ceremony called Mundan ceremony that nobody really remembers. But it's a big event for parents, and it's a big event wherein you're going through photo albums and you can see a bald, tiny little guy sitting there and weeping, and the entire family is clapping and laughing. So if you tell them the stories about those days, they would absolutely love to hear some of these. Going to the second one, tell the stories about what life was when you were young, about where you grew up, your neighborhood, your school, your friends. They love to hear about theirs, about the picnics that you've had, about the holidays that you took with their grandparents, with your parents, and how simple picnics and holidays were so enjoyable, and you did not want to go to an outside location to just enjoy yourself. It's absolutely wonderful. We have Justin, and I have been hearing a lot of travel stories from him, and I have been experiencing the world from his stories. So I'm sure he will have an interesting story for us for the travel stories that he's been telling his children and grandchildren.
Grandchild and one daughter. So this is just one ridiculous story that happened. We were driving in Croatia, and we were returning from Dubrovnik to back to the capital, which is Zagreb in the north. And so Croatia is a thin, long country, and you have, when you're going north, you have the sea, the Adriatic Sea on the left. And very often, like it happens when you punch into the GPS, your destination. We were driving up to a place called Plitvice Lake. It's a very beautiful lake with lots of beautiful waterfalls. And the GPS went haywire, and it asked me to go right. So I just blindly followed the GPS instead of using my brains. And I came to this checkpoint, where we had to show a passport. And the woman takes a passport, checks it, stamps it, and gives it back to me. And I'm wondering, like, why am I going through a border point at this point? I didn't even stop to think. And we drove a good 40 kilometers or so. And all around us were mountains. And my daughter was telling me, Dad, we should be seeing the sea on the left, but we've got mountains around us. And I said, I have a feeling we have driven into Serbia. So let me pull into a petrol station and find out where we are. So we found a petrol station, drove in, and there were these two huge guys, like you see in these bad guys in these horror movies. And they spoke only Russian, because Serbia was formerly a part of the USSR. And I asked him, where am I? What is the name of this town? So he pulls out this big map and he says, you are in this town. And it's far away from Croatia. And I said, how do I go to Plitvice? He says, you can either drive north along Serbia, or you can drive back to Dubrovnik and then carry on north via Croatia. So I got back into the car and I said, let me just go back to Dubrovnik. And my daughter tells me, Dad, do you realize you drove into an entirely new country altogether because you followed the GPS's instructions without using your own brains? I said, yes. Isn't that fantastic? That you can make a mistake like that and go into a new country altogether. So now we can add Serbia to the list of countries we have traveled to. If the GPS had not made a mistake and sent me there, we wouldn't have Serbia on our list of countries. So that is one strange travel story. There are several other stories, but we will keep them for another day.
True, true. So I think we have
So,
already
so we have
covered.
spoken, yeah, we've
Yes.
covered quite a bit in the area of culture, religion, values, and the fact
Yes,
that
yes.
that the beauty of life is sharing our mistakes and vulnerabilities.
I think the activity is
what
also
activity?
around calling people to share their stories. We've already done that, so we'll move ahead. Do you want to talk about this, Justin? Yes. Very briefly,
Yeah,
because we're already sitting just 1 minute away from 1 o'clock. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. So the thing is, yeah, like we started off saying, it's about the stories. It's about the stories that you're telling, and we are naturally storytellers. As human beings, we've got storytelling inside us. So if you think that you're not a storyteller, remember the time when every time that you meet up with a good friend, or in college when you sat around the coffee shop and you narrated stories to each other, or you're talking on the phone to a good friend, and you are on the phone for hours on end. What do you think you were doing? You were telling stories. So it's just a matter of deciding, okay, what am I going to tell my kids today or my grandkids today, and tell that story. And the idea is, even if you were, don't always keep a learning at the end of the as the objective. Sometimes you just want to entertain them, tell them a funny story, like this travel story. There's no major learning as such. It's just a funny story that you will remember for the longest time, and so just be yourself and tell your stories. That's really it. And and importantly, what stories are we not just telling our stories, telling our kids, but what stories are we making with our kids today in our daily lives? Because those are the stories that they're going to be telling their children when they grow up. Shruti.
Yeah, I think that's it. That brings us to the end of our webinar. There are few, I would first like to say that please don't leave without giving us a feedback. We have a small section right in the end where we will give you some very brief practical tips in case you're looking for to start storytelling from tomorrow on. And before that, I have shared a link on the chat box, which is for feedback. Please make sure you give us some feedback before you leave. I share my screen again for the last thing, which is, okay. These are some very simple tips that we want to share with you, because what we generally hear from people is that, yes, we liked your webinar, but we're still struggling to identify which stories to tell. We don't have stories. So to help you start telling story to your children from tomorrow, these are some of the tips. Find things that you probably brought from a holiday, a souvenir standing somewhere in your showcase, or a fridge magnet. Start telling stories about that. Piece of jewelry that you probably received from your grandparents or from your parents. Start telling about the background of those things, that where they were bought from and in what circumstances they were bought. What value do they stand in your life? Talk about paintings. Just grab hold of old photo albums lying somewhere in the back shelf of a cupboard and start talking about where was this picture clicked, and who are the people in the picture, what is your relationship with these people. There are important days and significant milestones in our life. These could be positive milestones like your birthdays, your wedding, religious events. These could be some not so good events as well, about loss of a relative, or maybe where you had to change cities because of certain reason, change of houses, change of jobs. I have heard this story in my family very often, where my dad had to shut a factory which was doing very well, and he had to digress to a completely different business because the Delhi government had made a rule that the factories will not run in the NCR region. He had to shut that factory and find a completely new business. How did my family react to that? Probably we were very young to remember the instance, but over the years we have heard the stories of how my mom and I, we used to get together, and it would become a small scale industry in the house just to support the new business. So we have not only lived the stories, but because we were too young to remember them, we have heard the stories also. That is what I bring to with me even now, wherein I had the strength to leave a corporate job and start a new venture on my own. I get that strength from my family because I've seen that happen, and I have heard the stories of those times. And these are some of the things that you can constantly share with your children. Important people. Have we ever shared a story of a close friend or a teacher or a colleague? By doing something like that, you tell the children that teach them how to respect teachers, that there was a teacher who made an X impact on your life, which is why you have a particular trait in you. So a maths teacher or a chemistry teacher that helped you find your stream when you were in 10th. So those stories. And we have, I think, already talked a lot about the picnics, the holidays, the work-related travel, and the religious travels. These are some of your key takeaways from this webinar, that think of one of these and start telling the stories and see the magic happening. Last but not the least, what we want you to do is that we want you to start telling stories starting today. And if any of you have or see a positive impact in your children, we would love to hear from you. Please leave us a note on email or on any of our contacts maybe, and we would love to hear from you. And if you want us to kind of publish that story on our social media platform, please let us know about that as well. Anyone, if you wants to share a story about the story that you told after this webinar to your children and how they reacted to it, we would love to hear about that. With this, I formally say that we've ended this webinar. Sorry that we are about 6 minutes late. We generally like to close on time, but if anybody wants to say anything, thank you so much. Does anybody wants to share anything?
I would like to say that today's session was very interesting so far the parenting is concerned, irrespective of the age of your children. Because as Justin is the ideal example, we have got grandchildren to come. It was very interesting, and that has given us a great insight, how to share with our children or the children who are closely related or in the society. I found it very, very useful, but I think today's timing was not adequate because lots of discussion. We have to give some time for the discussion, for the engagement, and for the activities also.
True.
But we would like, certainly would like, if you can continue the same session in the next, whatsoever is left out, if according to you, if whatsoever is left out, if you can continue in the next session, we'll be extremely happy, because the enthusiasm level has come to the climax. And
No, thank you, Joshi. Thanks for the encouraging word. We agree that these sessions sometimes feel short of time, but we will definitely try to do another one soon. Thank you so much for joining us.
I just wanted to say, if you have those PPT, if you can send it to us, we could reinforce our learnings again.
Sure, we'll do that.
Great session.
I would like to add one point, if you
Yes.
permit me.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. I think we have to recognize one particular person in all our lives. That is our grandmothers. They're the first one who taught us stories, who made us sleep with lullabies and different Chandamama stories and all that. I think that is how the art of storytelling in a sweet voice, and it was like a lullaby. Half the story you used to sleep off, and the next half used to continue to the next day. So that is, I think, that is how most of us picked up the art of storytelling. So a special tribute to all the grandmothers.
Ravi, it's interesting you say that, but NIIT, where my wife used to work at, way back, like 30 odd years back, had this grandmother's birthday day where they were given a sum of money. I forget whether it's 1,000 rupees or whatever. The figure would have changed over the period of years, where a amount of money was given to the employee for a birthday gift or a cake to be bought for the grandmother on her birthday.
Wonderful.
Can you imagine? They had some very crazy HR things, and this was one of those things. Grandmother, recognizing Grandmother Day. So it's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. You have to recognize, because they are the first storytellers to us.
Yeah, that's right.
And I remember the hole in the wall and all that stuff NIIT did.
Yeah.
Thanks to both Justin and Shruti for this opportunity.
Thank you. It's
Thank you
been
so
wonderful
much.
having all of you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Taking out the skills in us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Have a wonderful weekend, all of you.
Thanks. Same to you.
Okay.
You too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Shant, you want to say anything?
No, so thanks a lot, Shruti. Thanks a lot, Justin. I think 90 minutes well spent. In fact, I think though the time was a little bit crunch, but we didn't lose our attention even for a minute, and quite comprehensively. So I think the purpose with which we would have assembled here, that was fulfilled to a certain extent. The need for storytelling was established really well, and secondly is that quite a few useful techniques mentioned across which can be implemented immediately. It's more about establishing the purpose, and I think well spent Saturday morning.
Thank you so much, Nishant. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone. If anyone else wants to share anything, or if you have any questions, we would love to answer.
Yeah.
Please do leave us a feedback. Joshi sir, please make sure you give us a feedback. Thank you so much.
Very sure.
Thank you.
Hi, Shruti. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Shruti. I'm Chitra here. I think you must be getting a name as Ashriya because I couldn't change the name.
Yes,
so I'm so connected. I mean, obviously today being Ganesh Chaturthi, I'm just wishing you all happy Ganesh Chaturthi. And I was quite occupied with the work, with puja and the other things. But actually, I kept it on mute and I could hear a lot of things. Of course, I have a daughter, 5-year-old, and I was very interested to understand whatever has been covered so far. Of course, it's been connected. So such kind of sessions should be there. Even going further, probably we can be part of it. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for taking out time even on a festival. That's what me and Justin were discussing. This time our session had much lower attendance than what we generally get. And I'm guessing it's probably because of the...
Yeah, in fact, I was about to send a message yesterday, but then I said, I think it probably not a right way, because I was about to send you a text saying that, if you can postpone it, people must be busy with, festival things. And this is something which, see, even for me, I don't wanted to miss it. I wanted to hear it completely, but in between somewhere even I missed maybe certain words of it or parts of it. But yes, despite of
I know it's our bad. We, sitting in Delhi, did not foresee Ganesh Chaturthi as much as the rest of India does. Maybe.
Yeah, I understand.
So, yes, we will probably take care of it, and we'll probably organize another session soon.
Yeah, I'll be happy to be part of it. And I think going forward, I can share certain topics. Maybe we can just cover up, going further.
We would love to hear.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Shall we log off? Yeah.
Anyone else? No, I think we're done. Thank you so much for joining us. In case you have any questions, you can mail it to us, or you can find us on any of the social media platforms, Facebook, LinkedIn, anywhere. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Cheers. And
Thanks,
have a
Aditya.
wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.